Welcome to this event at Hudson Institute. My name is Dr. Rebecca Heinrichs. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson and the director of our Keystone Defense Initiative. We have an excellent panel here to talk about the relationship between China and Russia. My work here at Hudson focuses on how to maintain the nuclear peace. And so, of course, my interest with the China and Russia relationship is how the two countries are increasingly collaborating on the military front and what that does to stress America's nuclear deterrent. China and Russia separately pose the greatest threat to the United States, but simultaneously, they pose an incredibly difficult problem. This is the first time that the United States must deter two nuclear peers simultaneously. The partnership between the two countries is growing on multiple fronts, diplomatically, economically, and of course, militarily. And so today we have an excellent expert panel to discuss the various dimensions of the partnership and to help us to think about ways that we can potentially mitigate or respond to these in a way that is conducive to the United States and the security and freedom of our allies. Directly to my left, I have John Luff. He's a geopolitical expert with a background in Russia and Eastern Europe, whose 35-year career has spanned the worlds of business diplomacy and research. Before moving to the Nest Center, he was a partner at Highgate, a leading London-based strategy consulting firm. Since 2009, he's been an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, London, where he has written extensively on a wide range of issues related to Russia and Ukraine. And he leads Nest's center's work on foreign policy issues. I thought this was very, very interesting and noteworthy. He spent 6 years with NATO, managing information programs aimed at Central and Eastern Europe, including a posting to Moscow where he set up NATO's information office in Russia. He was the first alliance official to be permanently based in Russia from 1995 through 1998. Sergei Alekashenko is an expert on the economics. Oh, wait, well, I'm going to drop. This isn't Sergei right here, but we've got Sergei here on the end.
I feel like it's Sergei now.
Yeah, why not? Let's change names.
Sergei and Miles. Sergei is an expert on the economics of Russia and Ukraine, as well as the global economy and financial system. He is well known for his publications and commentary on economic change in Russia. His work focuses on macroeconomic issues and the structural transformation of the Russian and Ukrainian economies after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he leads Nest Center's research on economic issues. Between 2021 and 2024, he ran his own consultancy business, advising clients on political and investment development in Russia, Ukraine, and other countries of the former Soviet Union. He left Russia as a political refugee in 2014. And from 2015 to 2019, he was a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. In 2017 to 2018, he contributed to the drafting of Alexei Navalny's presidential program. We're thrilled to have him here with us as well. And my friend and colleague here at Hudson, Miles Yu. He's a senior fellow and director of the China Center at Hudson Institute. He is also professor of East Asia and military and naval history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Dr. Yu specializes in Chinese military and strategic culture, U.S. and Chinese military and diplomatic history, and U.S. policy towards China. Dr. Yu joined the Trump administration during the first administration and served as the China policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. In that capacity, he advised the Secretary on all China-related issues, helped overhaul U.S. policy towards China, and participated in key U.S. government interagency deliberations on major policy and government actions with regard to China and other East Asian countries, including Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. I think it's not an overstatement to say that the United States really getting on much sounder footing in deterring China and understanding the Chinese Communist Party is really owed to the work of Dr. Yu, and so I'm thrilled to have him here with us today as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, if we can, and then first a few minutes of remarks. Then we'll go to Miles, and then Sergei, and then have a discussion. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I believe this is my first visit to Hudson, so it's great to be on a panel here. So I want to make three points. Firstly, I want to talk about the nature of the relationship between Russia and China. This is not an alliance, as is often commonly believed. It is a deep and indeed deepening relationship. It's a partnership based on cold strategic logic. Each side needs the other, and for Russia, China is a very significant force multiplier. Both sides see a historic opportunity to displace Western influence in the global system and to rebalance it in line with their interests. Now, I'd add that this vision is somewhat vague. For Putin, it's this kind of polycentric system that can somehow be harmonized to the advantage of all. It all sounds so wonderful. And President Xi, you've got the sovereign equality principle that was loud and clear in the governance initiative that he put forward recently at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. Both talk about the need for greater democracy in international relations, not something that applies at home, of course. But there are, I think, important differences too between them. Firstly, Russia is, in its current form, is attracted by disorder and is happy to embrace it. It's in a hurry to change this sort of international constellation. Meanwhile, it seems to me that China prefers a slower and more ordered approach to change. So I think there's actually quite a sort of fundamental difference there. And one should add also that for all this sort of bonhomie between the two leaders, there is an underlying distrust between Russia and China, and it's quite significant. I think the Chinese intelligence services are very active, it seems, in Russia. Most of the arrests of Russian academics and others in recent years have been, in fact, related to accusations of cooperation with the Chinese side or of recruitment by the Chinese side. So that's quite an interesting sort of dimension to this relationship. My second point is that Putin at the moment is sitting pretty. He believes he can win the war in Ukraine quickly, and he sees the erosion of the transatlantic link being, I think, at a sort of reasonably advanced stage. He's not afraid of more US sanctions, and he sees the possibility for a reset with the United States on the basis of a pragmatic relationship. And this promises to lead to the emergence of effectively a tripolar world, with Russia as a kind of geopolitical pivot between the US and China. And I think from the Kremlin's perspective, this is achievable without, in fact, without having to give too much away. So in that sense, I think Putin feels quite confident and sees that he can both bring value to China, but at the same time retain a voice for Russia in this I suppose, constellation that may emerge. So my third point is that the notion of this reverse Nixon strategy is, of course, a fantasy. Why would Russia want to turn away from China when it currently receives so much benefit from that relationship? The distrust in the United States is far greater than it is towards China. And there's no doubt that the Kremlin retains a perception of the US deep state. It doesn't believe, I think, fundamentally that this is going to go away anytime soon. And then you have the Chinese support for the war in Ukraine, and this is absolutely vital. And I don't think Russia would be fighting the way it is today if China had not been behind it. And it's not just a question, of course, of buying crude oil from Russia, but also the provision of these dual-use technologies. And somebody pointed out to me a while back that when Russia built its defensive lines after the Ukrainian counteroffensive of late 2022, there was something like, I think, 2,000 bulldozers that were delivered from China to the Russian Federation, and that led then to the construction of this so-called Surovikin line. So those technologies, a variety of them, of course, now being used in the Russian drone industry, are very, very important. But there have been more banal things as well, hence the reference to the bulldozers. But Beijing definitely does not want to see Russia defeated in this war. I think it's absolutely clear, and they've even said as much. So the eternal question in Russia, what is to be done about this? Then I am not somebody who is in a position to offer strategic advice to the government of the United States, but I would say that if the war in Ukraine can be ended, I think that will take some of the short-term impetus out of this relationship and this very strong need to cooperate. And in fact, then raise perhaps broader questions on both sides about where all this is going and in fact, what is achievable.
Thank you. Miles.
Thank you, Dr. Heinrich, and you've always been a leader in the nuclear strategy and issue here, and also a good friend. So this actually, participating in this panel brightened my day, because this morning I was rather down because I was waiting for a call from Nobel Committee from Norway, but the call didn't come, so I feel, but this is bright light. Now here's the thing, Russia and China, well, over the last about 100 years or so, the world was kind of, we have been living in some kind of dichotomy, if you will. It's like a great divide. That is, roughly, you can translate into some kind of two camps, right? East and West. So that is, for much of that period, this two-camp system, dichotomy, manifests itself in the form of the Western democracy versus communism. So, and then let's just, if you were in use Hollywood parlance, is good guys versus bad guys. So today we're going to focus on the bad guys side. So for much of this period, the bad guys basically was led by the Soviet Union. Leadership of the communist movement on that camp was unchallenged until somewhere after Stalin died, the middle to the late 1950s, and China said the Soviet Union was not really tough enough. They were not good. So China wants to take leadership. So that ethos of Russia and China competing for the #1 bad guy has always been the kind of mentality. There's a very interesting dynamic between the two. Now, of course, there is a revolution of 1989, and subsequently the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. So China say, hey, listen, Russia, the Soviet party is not good enough. They failed. So China now carries the torch of the communist movement. It believes it's the only savior of the socialist vision, right? So Russia, of course, has a very different agenda, no more communism, but Russia has this ambition of restoration of its past imperial glory. So we call it the revanchism, whatever you call it. So that basically is where right now. So I think China and Russia, I mean, the sheer reality is that Russia and China, they're not really on a par in many, many aspects. Russia's economy is tiny compared to China's. It's less than 1/10 of China's economy. So this is what we're talking about. Russia has a decisive advantage over China in terms of nuclear arsenal, and it's basically in that area. But in the conventional arena, China also surpassed Russia in many aspects, right? It's the technology and the military advancement. So, but there's something very common among these two. Number one is what unites the two is no longer communism versus democracy. Rather, it's basically anti-West sentiment, as John said very eloquently earlier. So anti-West out of a different kind of a motive, right? So and for Russia, basically putting inside NATO. For China, basically is ideologically based. The West is the ultimate grave digger of the communist China. So that's what they believe. So that's why there's this very broad global scheme going on from Beijing. But they all share the anti-West similarities, that's one. Number two, what really is important about the two countries, Russia and China as well, those were only remaining what I call civilization states. Civilization states is a very important concept because those two countries believe they're the center of a civilizational bloc, Slavic or Chinese. So it's not just a country. And this is very important. This is this mentality of a civilization state propelled Russia to invade Ukraine because Vladimir Putin didn't believe Ukraine should have a sovereign and independent stance because it's part of the Slavic, Russia-centered civilization. So China has the same thing. So, so you have that kind of mentality. And I think thirdly, there is also basically material mutual dependency there. If you notice that for Russia, its greatest insecure vulnerability is the Russian Far East from point of view of Vladimir Putin. one have to understand Vladimir Putin fancies himself as the Far East expert. I mean, this guy judo master doing all kinds of things over there. So he wanted to use Chinese capital or sometimes Japanese capital to develop Russia's Far East. And that has been all his dream. Now, China, of course, is focused, is not in the Far East in that way. They believe that part is just the US sphere of influence. China eyes Europe and the Middle East and Central Asia. That's the official impetus, or the initial impetus for the Belt and Road Initiative. But the two actually try to converge. And that's why you see the mechanism is energy. And so Russia, Putin was the guy who was pushing China to sign all kinds of energy bills. Since 2014, there were 5 gigantic energy and gas bills between China and Russia. So 2014 one was $400 billion, right, for 30 years. And then it all has something to do with the building Siberia pipeline. China was very reluctant to do, so which constantly put Putin, Putin to go to Beijing and to push for the concrete implementation of that. Of course, there's also a price to pay, and there's kind of a horse trading, quid pro quo. Remember, days before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and Putin was in China, signing another bill in February 2022, a gigantic gas bill. So this is kind of an unlimited friendship talk at the time. So what I'm saying is that there is mutual defense. Now there's a lot of difference over there. I agree with John completely. China and Russia share some very different global perspectives. Russia, in my view, wants to gain global relevance. China wants to gain global dominance. There's a huge difference over there. So, and also Putin and Xi Jinping, for example, these two were men of enormous egos. So there's a clash of ambitions. Even though they share broad anti-West ideology, they share broad logic of aggression. Over Taiwan and Ukraine, the same kind of logical aggression. But they have a different vision over there on their ego. Very much like Hitler and Stalin. I mean, at times they work together, right? They signed this treaty in 1939. And of course, ultimately, they're going to have some kind of fundamental clash. The clash also centers on, also has something to do with the legacy of history, because Russia has a lot more friends, traditional friends, developed during the Soviet era. In the Chinese neighborhood, all of Russia's traditional friends are Chinese adversaries. They hate China. India and Vietnam, for example. So this is very important. And I think that Russia does not want to abandon that part. And Russia has also a very strong relationship with the ASEAN countries. Remember, in February 2016, ASEAN, all of the heads of state of the ASEAN countries went to Sochi for a ASEAN-Russia summit. And if you read the Sochi Declaration, they call it, and it's really, really interesting because they talk about, this is at the height of the Chinese-Filipino debate. You know, the controversy, the court case in The Hague. So, and in this atmosphere, I mean, the Sochi Declaration said, we're going to uphold the freedom of navigation, we're going to respect the territorial integrity, we're going to basically no use of force to settlement in the South China Sea. That's all in China. So they share that part of it too. So that's different. That's why you see every time Russia sells weapons to China, and Russia sells the exact same weapons to Vietnam and India, with which to counter China. So that's a very interesting dynamic. So they have a different different approach. And I think it also about the reverse Nixon-Kissinger, we don't have to exaggerate the degree to which Nixon and Kissinger were brilliant. I mean, the whole idea of Kissinger, not reverse, the Kissinger approach to China is a fantasy. If you know, 1971, 1972, what was Nixon's primary preoccupation? They were not the Soviets. It was the Vietnam. So the entire motive, impetus for Nixon administration to go to China was to ask China to help China just get out of Vietnam so Nixon could win 1972 re-election. It was the Chinese, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in particular, that want to elevate this kind of transactional deal with the United States to a much more strategic level, because China and the Soviet Union were almost at war with each other. 2 years before that, they actually almost went to the war, right? So you see, China wants to play. It's Nixon and Kissinger keep saying, we play the China card very brilliantly. That's not true. The reverse is true. China played the American card much, much more brilliantly than Nixon, Kissinger claimed themselves. So that's one of the reasons I don't think is going to work with that. If there's any kind of reverse Nixon Kissinger type of this, I think the initiative will come from Russia, not from the United States. And if you recall, I hate to cite this incident, I'm sorry, it took too long, but one final note. If you pay attention, in the immediate aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion, Tucker Carlson went to Moscow, had a several hour long, very long interview with Putin in the Kremlin. And at some point, Tucker Carlson asked Vladimir Putin, why do you, Mr. President, make Russia the enemy of the West? Does anybody remember what Putin, how he replied? He said, well, we don't want to make Russia, the enemy of the West. As a matter of fact, we're not the enemy of the West. China is. That was an astonishing reply. Okay, I'll just end right there.
Thank you, Miles. Sergey?
Me. After this brilliant presentation,
Thank you.
I have to talk about some boring, about economics, about numbers, about money. But I remember from my childhood, I was raised in the Soviet Union, as you can remember, this fight between good guys and bad guys. Of course, Soviets were good guys. Americans, they were bad guys. They were bad guys. They defeated us in ice hockey in 1980, so we cannot forget it.
I grew up in communist China, so when we grew up, we came, don't waste any food because look at it, the starving children in the United States.
Yeah, correct. And talking about economic relations about Russia and China, I will split it in three parts. First is trade, and the second is investment, and third is technology. On trade, nothing strange is going on. You talked about gas and oil deals, but we with John had our history in the beginning of 2000s. Strangely, in the private business, we were participating in the joint stock company owned a huge gas field near Irkutsk in eastern Siberia in Russia. It's independent. It was independent, owned by Russian oligarchs. And we dreamed about agreeing with China on export gas to China. It was 2000, 2001, 2003, well before Putin went to China. And the idea of oil pipeline to China from eastern Siberia was originated by Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2002 in Yukos, well before Putin thought about this. So for Russia, Russia is a country that is exporting natural resources, commodities. That is the basis. Oil is primary resource, and all the rest is, okay, up to 80% is oil, gas, metals, wood, pulp, grain, so that's it, fertilizers. And nothing strange was with gas and oil pipelines because historically Russia, Soviet Union exported them to the West. And it was dependence. Not only Europe dependent on Russian gas and oil. Russian economy dependent on European market as well. And that's why Russian oligarchs, they were looking forward saying we need the second leg. Our oil and gas fields are moving to the east, and we need to find the exit to the eastern market, to China, dominantly. In the beginning of 2000s, it was visible that China is growing up and that China needs resources. And here's the basis that Russian economy and Chinese economy, to a great extent, they're complementary. Russia is a huge exporter of commodities and natural resources. China is short in natural resources. China is desperately looking for natural resources all over the world. And two countries having a huge common border, very simple logistics, not dependent on maritime traffic that could be cut by NATO or by someone else. So why not to trade? One country sells commodities, other country purchases commodities. Another country is a huge industrial factory producing 30% of industrial production in the global. Another country is historically short of consumer goods, of consumer electronics, of everything. So we sell commodities, we purchase consumer goods. We sell commodities, we purchase consumer goods. And of course, when, once again, historically, the big part, the dominant part of the Russian population is in European part. And it's more easy to trade with Europe. Shorter logistics, bigger population. But when Europe blocked Russian trade, a significant part of Russian trade with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, no other choice. China is ready. China is ready to supply everything. Smartphones, cars, watches, clothing, everything. Russia was supplying oil and gas and fertilizers to Europe. Okay, Europe is not purchasing. Let's deliver them to China. It's a global market. No one can substitute Russian oil in globally. Russia is, if we take the global oil market and we deduct, let's say, domestic consumption. For example, United States is #1 in oil production. But it's all oil produced in the United States is consumed in the United States. The United States imports some oil, refine, and sell refined products. But in the international market, the share of United States in oil is marginal. Russia keeps 15% of the global international oil market. There is no one country in the world which can substitute. So if Europe do not purchase oil, and Europe purchases oil from Persian Gulf, okay, somebody should purchase Russian oil. It's India and China. And it's nothing. It's nothing strange. So, and I believe that nothing could be done with this area. Even the war is over. Even relations with the West of Russia, with the West will improve, and there will be some level of mutual understanding. It doesn't matter which level, even good friendship. Still, Russia and China will trade much more than before the war. It's geography, it's logic, and it's a hedging. It's a hedging of something made strange. If Europe cut trade with Russia once, it could cut trade twice. Let's keep two legs, Europe and China. So I see nothing strange in trade relations between Russia and China, and they will stay strong. Second is investment. It's more interesting. Putin started to talk about pivot to the east in 2010. Even it was not Putin, it was President Medvedev who started to talk about pivot to Asia because Russia organized an Asian summit in Vladivostok in 2012. Putin came to Kremlin back in 2012, and his initial slogan, pivot to the east, was not to China, was not to outside of the Russia, it was for inside Russia, about Russian Far East. It was pivot to problems of Russian Far East. 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, first sanctions, and here Putin said, okay, pivot to east means pivot to China because Western markets are closed. Well, first of all, Western financial markets are closed. And by that time, Russia needed a lot of capital, both banks and corporate sector. And the dream was, okay, China will help us. China has huge coffers of money, and China will give us money. All Russian companies, government, ministers, banks run into China and get nothing. China says, no, well, yeah, we have money, we have plenty of money, and not for you guys. Since 2014, until the beginning of the war, until the end of 2021, there were 24 investment projects of Chinese companies in Russia, overall value of $16.5 billion. This is the database of American Enterprise Institute, so your neighbors. And they include all investment of 50 million plus. So out of this $16 billion, half, $8.5 billion, were three particular portfolio investment in liquefied natural gas, LNG, in northern part of Russia, and petrochemical company in Sibur. So all the rest, 21 projects for $8 billion in 8 years. It's about nothing. If we remember that China invested in the world more than, I don't know, there are debates, 1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion. So Russia is not the place for Chinese money. China is not ready to inject money in Russia. Why? Very simple. We don't need competitor. If we give you money, if we give you our technology, what will you do? You will produce the same goods as produce Chinese economy, and you will compete with us. We are not interested in this. And because of that, the third part, the most interesting, historically, the Russia, Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia, technologically were dependent on the West, on Europe and the United States. All Stalin's industrialization was built by Americans and Germans. So historically, Soviet economy, Russian economy, purchased technology, know-how, capital, not like money, but like technology and knowledge from the West. Since the beginning of the war, this is closed, shut down, sorry. And, okay, China, will you supply us any technology? No, says China. China says, look, economic benefits, it's not about technology. Economic benefits, you can sell your goods and purchase our products. That is the benefit of the trade. That is the future of Chinese and Russian relation. So, and if we talk about what could be done, further on, is there any way for the US administration to make a pressure on Russia-Chinese relations? It's about technology. Yes, if the economy has no access to investment in technology for 2, 3, 5 years, you can see no result. So statistically, no evidence. If it is 10 years, lack of investment is technological degradation. So when the war is over, and when the dust will disappear, the fog of war will disappear, Russia will start to dream about access to technology. And here's the bargain coin for the West, for the US. Okay, we have technology. You need technology. Let's think about this. So thank you.
Wonderful. I'd like to, I want to press a little bit on this theme of China's interest in Russia's war against Ukraine. Because I think, John, you raised a really interesting point about how if that war ends, that there might be a potential opening where the two of them may not have such a motivation to continue working together. But isn't China highly motivated in Russia continuing the war against Ukraine? And because there seems to be, and the reason I think this is important, because sort of there is this American persistent thought, and it was really prominent during the Biden administration, less so during the Trump administration, but definitely during the Biden administration, that perhaps we could get China to pressure Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Why is that not a useful framing and way for the United States to expend its diplomatic energies?
Well, I think up until relatively recently, from a Chinese perspective, it was useful to see the United States and its allies distracted by Ukraine. But now, with the reduced interest from Washington in, how shall I put it, diplomatically, European affairs, then I think that calculation has to change. I think from the outset, the Chinese were definitely not expecting a long war. Putin undoubtedly informed the Chinese about his intentions, but as we know, he was expecting something very brief, and he felt he had everything on his side, and the Ukrainians would just cave in. So China has, I think, had to, I suppose, accustom itself to the fact that Putin's word in this case was not reliable. So he was misinformed, and that probably tells us a little bit about, again, I've had a suspicion for a long time, and this goes back to the days when, in fact, Sergei and I were involved in this gas business, trying to get East Siberian gas to China and beyond. That certainly when I was talking to the Chinese side at the time, say over 20 years ago, there was this sense that the Russians were really not very good at strategy. And I think that this sort of rather patronizing attitude, if I may put it that way, towards the Russian counterparts. So, seeing this extraordinary strategigic blunder that Putin has made, and Sergei's referred to the technology problem that Russia now faces. I mean, Sergei, I would suspect this has put Russian economic development back by at least a couple of decades, if not more. These are the consequences. If you're looking at this from the Chinese perspective, you think, why would a country do this? Why would you do this to yourself? So I think that there's this sort of underlying kind of frictional, maybe, disbelief the way Russia's played its cards. But look, it's got itself into this situation. China most certainly doesn't want to have a failing state on its borders. And so, some of this enthusiastic talk, particularly at the start of the war, that Russia could be defeated, it might break up, and all that sort of thing. Well, I mean, that's hardly an attractive recipe for China, is it? It doesn't want another North Korea. So it's pretty much, seems to me, morally bound to give Russia the support it needs, so it doesn't lose. But what should the outcome be? I mean, I personally think that China is actually very interested in the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Which is interesting then, because that was part of the condition for the Trump administration's effort for the minerals deal in Ukraine, is that none of the countries that contributed to Russia's war effort should have anything to do with Ukrainian reconstruction.
Yeah.
So Miles, you would comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question. I mean, it's the world has to understand China is a country of opportunism. You look at it. Now, you talk about Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, definitely. China right now is playing the role of either mafia don or puppet master, because it needs the ultimate bad guy visually to the world to take the bullet for China. It was North Korea, now it's Russia before, right? And then Iran. So China is always behind. China make those three countries, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, is proxies. So that the world will focus on those actors committing violence and crimes on the street. China is sitting behind, like Don Corleone, acting strategic and very, very magnificent, benevolent. So this is basically the thing. Definitely, China wants to use the Ukraine war as a strategic distraction for the United States. However, back to my point about opportunism, don't forget, before the war in Ukraine, China's policy China and Ukraine have very close relationship all the way. They signed no fewer than 3 strategic partnership agreements, including the agreement signed between Viktor Yanukovych, former president of Ukraine, in December 2013. This nuclear security guarantee deal, in which that if Ukraine would be attacked or threatened by a third country, Russia, with a nuclear weapons, China would provide Ukraine with a nuclear security guarantee, commonly known in the West as nuclear umbrella. This is insane. Well, 3 weeks later, Putin annexed Crimea. So, and then if you look at the weapons warehouses in the People's Liberation Army in China, virtually every major weapon platform come from Ukraine for over 20 years. Russian design and from so that's at a fraction of the price. Vladimir Putin, so one of the major income of this economy is weapon sales. So China sabotaged Vladimir Putin's major money source. So that's why he was mad at China and mad at Ukraine for a long time. So, if you go to China, the heavy engine bombers, it's the first aircraft carriers, the missile technologies. You go to China, there are a lot of Ukrainian villages over there. A lot of Soviet-trained Ukrainian weapon experts live in China. They've been there for decades, right? So that's why before the war in Ukraine, China basically was very anti-Russia in a very subterranean, furtive way. Because Vladimir Putin's dream of competing with the West economically is his grand design, something called the Eurasia Economic Union. There are 4 core members of that union, led by Moscow, of course: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Over the last 2 decades, China has been consistently undercut. They bought out much of the Kazakhstan, China, and then Ukraine was the crown jewel of the Vladimir Putin's dream for the future. So that's why there's a lot of stuff going there. And then the war in Ukraine started 3 years ago. China said this is basically a very good anti-West united front. So China switched sides, completely betrayed its strategic partners of Ukraine. So none of those treaties, agreement play any role at all. So this anti-West union over there. And I think, in this case, though, back to the second point that both Sergey and John mentioned about Russia lacks a strategic vision. This is so true. I mean, listen, Russia's pivot to the east, Far East, is really, I believe, is Putin's obsession. So the key point of a disagreement between China and Russia, despite all the agreements, is about development, particularly in pipelines, economic construction in the Far East. China didn't want to put money; they just wanted to get gas and oil, but not really build up this infrastructure. So that's one of the sticking points. The country that really realized this strategic focus of Russia was Japan. Under Prime Minister Abe, and Japan and Russia came really, really close, the closest since World War II. The two would have solved the problem of northern territories. So to the point that before February, before February 2014 annexation of Crimea, and Japan and Moscow were even talking about how to divide up the four countries. Japan have two, and Russia keep two. And the question is which two, right? Russia wants to keep the best two. So that's different, but that's a really gigantic progress. And the pipeline has something to do with where the terminal is going to be, right? Japan say, you're going to end somewhere in the Sea of Japan, so it's the international market, everybody has access to it. And China say, oh, you're going to end somewhere inside China. China will be the only customer. So that's the difference. So unfortunately, Vladimir Putin screwed up his own plan. I mean, he annexed Crimea, and Japan was forced to sanction Russia along with the Western democracies. So that's why, and Ukraine the same thing. So basically, I would just say, if there's any way for Russia to be closer to the West, and see, Vladimir Putin say we're going to basically curtail NATO. His invasion of Ukraine did the exact opposite, right? I mean, you have two new members, Sweden and Finland, join NATO. That's very important. In my view, I think one of the most consequential results of the war in Ukraine, detrimental to Russia's interest, is Finland joining NATO. Yeah. So Finland had the 800 miles border with Russia, and St. Petersburg just crossed the border. So that's very important. And U.S. now is basically built up Finland as a forward deployed fortress of NATO.
So I want to, that's a great place for me to sort of turn to Sergey then on the economic piece though. Your point about how even after Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, even if once that war ends in some kind of fashion, that this economic relationship between Russia and China, you fully expect to continue. What does that mean though then? Do you still support the potential of increased American sanctions against Russia to squeeze the Russian economy? Europeans are now once again discussing taking the Russian frozen assets and really kind of going after the corruption and Putin's corrupt oligarchs in Russia. I mean, or further sanctioning the shadow fleet, which the Europeans are even ahead of the United States on that. Isn't there still an economic element where the United States with our Western democratic allies can still squeeze the Russians economically? Or would you say it's not going to do much though because they're still going to have increased collaboration and support from China?
The latter. I believe that there is no space for the US or European or the West policy, sanctions policy, to increase pressure significantly on Russia, to make it visible and feasible. And I explained it on the case of oil. So let's imagine that somehow US imposed sanctions on Russia and Russia is not able to export its oil by sea. It's 2/3 of Russian export of oil, and including products. It's 5 million barrels per day. What happens next day? Oil price jumps, I don't know, $100, $120, $150, $200 per barrel. What's going on the gas stations? I don't know, $10, $5, $15? How much? Is it doable in the United States? Can any administration in the United States survive after that? No. No, it's not possible. The problem is that Russian economy is its basis is natural resources, commodities. And the global economy cannot survive without them. In 20 different types of commodities, Russia keeps one of the 5 top places as biggest exporter. So that's it. You can remember in 2018, the first Trump administration imposed sanctions on Russian aluminum company Rusal, saying, okay, we ban everyone to trade with Rusal, its entities, and so on and so far. Rusal is one of the 2 biggest non-Chinese global aluminum companies. And the sanctions should be effective 6 weeks from now. In 2 weeks, aluminum price in the United States increased by 20%. And the next day, the administration said, okay, so let's forget about it. Let's negotiate. Let's make a deal. Let's make a deal how to make the owner of Rusal be out of control of those companies, but no sanctions anymore. So it's not possible. It's not possible, and because there is no substitution for Russian natural resources. But there is no any economic means to do it. There is Russia violated international maritime law in Azov Sea, in Kerch Strait, and Black Sea. So, okay, you want to block Russian sea export of oil, maritime export of oil? Okay, block Danish Straits. Put, I don't know, 3 U.S. Navy's ships in the straits, no tankers in and out of the Baltic Sea. It's the core export facilities of Russia in Baltic Sea near St. Petersburg. It's very simple, no sanctions, just a blockade of Cuba in 1962. It's doable, it's easy, but $15 per gallon on gas stations around Washington, D.C. That's the price. That's the price of the question. About frozen assets, you haven't mentioned that I'm a former central banker. I was the first deputy governor of the Central Bank of Russia in mid-90s. And one of my first duties there was to analyze the security position of Russian foreign exchange assets abroad of the central bank. And the unanimous conclusion was that, okay, assets of the central bank are free of any legal disputes. So no one country can take assets of the central bank. Confiscation of assets is doable. It's a part of criminal law. It may be punishment if the crime is occurred on territory of the country. Russia's central bank assets are held majority in Belgium. So what is the law, criminal law, violated by the Central Bank of Russia in Belgium? That you may say, okay, Central Bank has violated some criminal law, and because of that, we confiscate its assets. No, it's not possible. It's not possible. So I do not believe there is any way to increase economic pressure. And it's not about the war. It's not about the war. For Putin, up to now, economy is not a reason to rethink his opportunistic ambition to invade of Ukraine. It was very opportunistic. It was very simple. It was 3-week invasion, like Budapest in 1956, like Prague in 1968, like Afghanistan in 1979. So Afghanistan was 10 years war after that. But initially, it was just in 3 days invasion, and that's it. It was very simple. Crimea, three days, and it's done. It's very opportunistic. But it's about war. It's not about economy.
I mean, I would just say that, but the Russian economy is doing so poorly. I mean, to your point, John, part of China's now potentially looking at Russia as a bad bet is that Russia has made such a terrible calculation for its reckless invasion of Ukraine. It is suffering economically. You do have this now addition of Finland and Sweden to the NATO alliance. Arguably, after the last NATO summit, the Trump administration has essentially switched and is now sort of really focusing on the increased lethality and strength of NATO. Seems to me that all of this has been such a bad consequence for Russia, which may create an incentive for the Chinese to sort of back away from this strategic partnership. Is that overly optimistic? I'll let you kind of think about that. And I do want to get time for questions, so I'll let you kind of think about that. Does anybody have a question sort of ready to go? Tom, I'm sure you do. Yeah.
question.
Tom, can you use the microphone so we can hear your
Sorry.
thoughtful?
Craig Kennedy has done some useful work on the state of the Russian banking sector as a consequence of the war. Russia has had bond sales that have failed. Their sovereign wealth fund is about used up. So my question is, will China, and maybe Miles will weigh in on this too, does China have any interest in helping out and solving those financial problems in Russia? I mean, Anders Ostlund and others have concluded that 2026 is going to be a year of real difficulty. You have already got almost hyperinflation. So,
Hyperinflation in Russia, 2026 predicted by economists that's going to be very difficult for the Russians. Will China bail out the Russians?
May I answer?
So we'll do quick responses so we can
no,
get to another question.
No, 2026 will not be difficult for Russia. It will not, there will not be hyperinflation because hyperinflation is 20% per month. Current Russian inflation is 8% annualized in the recent 12 months to 8. It's less than it was in March 2022, 23 here in Washington. Yeah, it was 9%. And Russia has a very good, Russian government has a very good macroeconomic team, and keeping macroeconomic stability is not very difficult. So Russia done it several times historically in the recent 150 years. I know Craig Kennedy very well. I worked with him in Merrill Lynch. He is a good guy in oil and gas business, but not in banking and not in financial analysis. So in the banking system, which is 80% owned by the government, there could not be a financial crisis because the government will bail out any of those banks. So don't believe, guys, if you read Anders Ostlund, he promised Russia will fall down in 2024, okay, not 2025, 2026, okay. Sooner or later, Russia will face some significant problems, some crisis, but it may be after the war as well. So I seriously believe, yes, Russian economy is not in a good shape, in a great shape. Its growth virtually evaporated. It's 1% GDP growth, but it's okay. Russian people are happy. They never lived as good materially as they live today. Since 2013, before the annexation of Crimea, the living standards, the household consumption increased only by 2-3%, so in decade, no growth at all, but it is historically the highest level of private consumption. People are happy.
Yeah, I think the way to sanction Russia, there's a direct way. I don't think there's many new sanction regimes left because Russia has been heavily sanctioned. However, there are many ways that could deal Russia, put a lot of pressure on Russia. Basically, the ultimate goal is to end the war, right? So, for example, one of the biggest, well, Russia, yes, I agree with Sergey completely. You know, Russia is an energy giant country, a lot of energies. But energy depends also on several things. Number one is delivery, right? The pipelines and other things. So right now, Russia is not really in a good, that's why they're trying to talk to Turkey and other places to basically build new pipelines. Number two, really is dependent on the world price of energy. In this case, the U.S. has done a great job because Donald Trump's energy policy is to gain energy independence. The United States now is worth the #1 oil production and export country. So that's basically keep the oil price, global price down. If price is low, and Russian economy will suffer. So that's basically the logic, right? I'm not the economic good with numbers, but that's basically logic. I think the numbers will also agree with my assessment. Number two really is about levy sanctions, not directly against Russia because we have very little tool left, but we have a lot of Western banks who are doing really terrible business with Russia secretly. The leading rogue bank of the world is HSBC, the British bank. And they have done so many terrible things. With the drug cartels, terrorism, China, and so it's basically is a rogue bank. I mean, basically, U.S. government has imposed several very serious punishment against that. So those countries, those banks, Western banks, they have to get their act together. Thirdly, I think this is probably tangentially, but it's important, is to really urge the energy consumption countries, particularly in Western Europe, to develop their own nuclear power energy independence. Do not really go to the path of economic energy suicide. That's the woke green energy. Germany is a very terrible lesson to learn from. So you got to really, really reduce your dependency on Russian oil.
Rebecca,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt you. Very important case about oil prices and oil production in the United States. You have to remember that costs of oil production in the United States are the highest. The average production costs are for new wells is $61 per barrel. For the existing wells is between 45 and 50. So if the oil price falls below 60, no new wells are drilled in the United States and oil production starts to decline. If the oil price is below 50, okay, production goes down very significantly. Cost of production of oil in Russia are $25 per barrel. So let's compete. I believe that if the United States, if the administration will push Saudis, is the only one country in the world which can increase production of oil is Saudi Arabia. If they inject another 2 billion barrels of oil in the international market, the oil price will fall to 50, and the United States will suffer first. Okay. Not Russia, but the United States.
I don't drive an ICE car anymore. I drive electric cars, but I do pay attention to how much money I'm saving from the internal combustion engine cars. So that's why the prices, as far as I've seen, I mean, keep it very reasonable and even down. So yes, cost is more, but the factor is that the United States, as long as we don't buy oil from internal market, the price will go down because we're independent energy-wise. So that's what I'm saying is it could work.
John, I want to give you just a couple minutes of last thoughts, and then I'll moderator's privilege to close us out.
Okay, very good. Rebecca, I'm going to come back to the question you asked there about the bad bet argument. And I mean, I think you can construct here a counter-thesis, unfortunately, which is that if you look at what's going on in Europe at the moment and the United States from both Chinese and a Russian perspective, you can say you've got this degree of polarization. You've got a loss of overall strategic vision. Is this alliance still really alive and kicking? Yes, we have the NATO summit that was reduced to about a morning so that we could keep the alignment around defense spending, but nobody wanted to go beyond that. So I do agree that Finland joining NATO is a really big deal. And I think on the Russian side, they're still struggling to understand how this happened. But the question remains of just how cohesive are we, and are we going to be over the coming years? And we can see the far right on the march in several European countries, including my own at the moment, with, again, an agenda that doesn't align with what we've traditionally known about having to contain Russia. In fact, look in Germany, you've got some actually very friendly voices on both on the far right and the far left when it comes to the question of Russia and support for Ukraine. So there is I would like to believe in your initial thesis, but I think we have to consider very seriously the other side of the question.
Yeah, I think that I think there's great opportunity here. I mean, it's from hearing my panelists, my colleagues here, a few things to consider, and that's that one, that the United States must understand the growing collaboration between these two authoritarian countries, that the motivating factor that makes them hostile to the United States and our Western allies is this anti-Western sentiment. And so in order for the United States and NATO, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, to contend with this is to pool our own resources, our own markets, and to increase that solidarity. And sort of this notion that the United States is going to try to potentially reset with the Russians in order to peel them off of the Chinese is a fool's errand. That it makes much more sense to increase solidarity with NATO, to make sure that the promises, the commitments made during the NATO summit are fulfilled, and that the United States further continues support for Ukraine and make sure that Ukraine succeeds as an independent sovereign democracy, ends Russia's war there, or at least enables Ukraine to have battlefield successes to freeze the war on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, so that we can bolster the eastern central front of the NATO alliance, and then out-compete China in all these other ways. And basically, you try to make China a bad bet for the Russians and Russia a bad bet for China, and that may present the best opportunity for the West and for free societies to maintain the peace and to strengthen our own advantages. So thank you so much for that very, very interesting conversation. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists.